Burn it down to the stone, the colonel said, and he said it the way another man might order coffee, which was the thing his officers had learned to fear most. Colonel Anton Dukov lowered the field glasses, looked once at the body cooling in the gravel beside the road grader, and felt nothing about it that was worth feeling. He had counted them already. 9 men and a station that had lost its water pressure 2 days ago, set against a corridor he intended to own before the storm front cleared and the satellites could see again. He keyed his handset. Bring the column up. All of it. There is nothing on that hill that can stop a single one of us. Behind him, 41 vehicles started their engines almost in unison, a sound like the whole earth clearing its throat, and not one driver, not one gunner, not the colonel himself, knew that 2,900 meters away a woman was already lying flat on the rusted catwalk of a water tower with her cheek against a rifle she had built by hand, breathing slow, doing arithmetic, deciding the order in which they would learn they had made a mistake. There is a thing that happens to a convoy commander in the first 90 seconds of an ambush he cannot locate, and it has been studied. The brain, deprived of a direction to point its fear at, does not calm down. It accelerates. It begins to manufacture threats from every quarter at once, because a danger with no address is a danger that could be anywhere, and a man who believes the danger is everywhere will eventually make the decision that gets his people killed. Dukov did not know this morning that he was about to become a case study. He believed he was about to become a footnote of a different kind, the officer who took the Tarn Reach in a single push and never had to explain the cost. The station was called Halbach. It had been a customs house once, back when the corridor carried trade instead of artillery, and what remained of it was a low stone building, a collapsed garage, a dead generator the size of a refrigerator, and the tower, which had held water for a town that no longer existed. Master Sergeant Russ Holloway had set up his command in the back room because it had the only intact wall thick enough to matter. He was 46 and tired in the specific way of a man who has spent 3 days doing math he keeps getting the same answer to. 9 able bodies. One of them, Corporal Sutter, with a wrist swollen black where a vehicle door had crushed it in the first contact. No air cover until the front lifted and the front was not lifting. The nearest friendly element was a relief column 11 hours out by the only road, and the only road ran straight up the throat of the pass that the colonel's 41 vehicles were currently filling like a flood filling a culvert. Holloway had not slept. He had a tin cup of something that had been coffee and was now just warm brown water, and he held it because his hands wanted a job. He was running the numbers again when Specialist Ferris came through the doorway, with his face doing the thing young soldiers' faces did when the sensors showed them something their training had no slot for. You need to see the thermal, Sergeant. Ferris was 23 and good with the gear and bad at hiding what it told him. The columns stopped. Lead elements just stopped. And there's, I don't know how to call it. Their command track is showing crew bailing out. Holloway set down the cup. He had not heard a single outgoing round from his own position, because there had not been one. Every man he had was accounted for and inside the stone. Whatever had stopped that column had not come from Halvik, or rather it had, and it had come so quietly that the thermal feed registered the effect a full second before anyone registered a cause. What Ferris was watching, 3 kilometers down the pass, was the death of a signals officer. The man's name was Brask, and he had been standing in the open hatch of the command vehicle when something arrived through him at a velocity that made the sound of its passage almost an afterthought. The crew did not understand at first what had happened. There was the captain, upright, mid-sentence, and then there was the captain folded over the lip of the hatch, and the only loud thing in the moment was his radio handset hitting the steel deck and skittering into the footwell. Men who have been in combat will tell you that the brain insists on a sound to match a death, and when the sound does not come, when a life simply stops with no thunder to account for it, something in the animal part of the mind refuses the information and asks for it again. The crew asked for it again by standing still for 2 full seconds, which is a very long time, and in those 2 seconds, the second shot took the gunner. Down the line, Dukov felt the column seize. He had the discipline not to ask his radio a question he did not yet have the right words for. He raised the glasses and swept the eastern ridge, because the eastern ridge was where a shooter should be. The geometry of the pass said so. Any officer who had read the same terrain reports Dukov had read would have put a marksman on that high shoulder of rock to the east, where the line of sight ran clean and the morning light would be behind him. Dukov found nothing on the eastern ridge because there was nothing there. He did not yet understand that he was about to spend the worst hour of his career looking confidently in the wrong direction, which is the most expensive thing a competent man can do. Inside Halvik, Holloway crossed to the back wall, lifted a loose board, and looked down the dim length of the service passage that ran toward the base of the tower. He already knew what he would not say out loud in front of his men, which was that he had been carrying a question for 4 days and had decided not to ask it, and the question had just answered itself. She had arrived on the 3rd day, in the back of the resupply truck that had also brought the bad news about the road. No fanfare, no paperwork that made sense, a travel case that she carried in her left hand and never set down where she could not reach it. A way of entering a room and immediately knowing both exits. The manifest had listed her as a logistics liaison, and Holloway had known that was a lie the way you know weather is coming by the pressure of it. And he had let the lie stand, because she had asked him to, and because something in the flat steadiness of her told him she was a person who lied only about the size of what she could do, never the other way. Her name on the manifest was Calder. The men had taken to calling her ma'am, and then, when that felt wrong, to not calling her anything, which is what soldiers do around a presence they cannot file. Her name was Naomi, and almost no one alive was authorized to know it, because on the only record that mattered, Naomi Calder had died 14 months ago in a vehicle fire in a country she had never officially entered. The death was real on paper, and that was the entire point of it. A dead woman draws no inquiries. A dead woman can be sent to a corridor that does not exist on the maintained maps to hold a road for a relief column that has been told it is escorting empty trucks. She had read the briefing on the flight in, had folded it, and had spent the rest of the flight doing what she always did, which was the only thing that had ever quieted the inside of her skull. She had run the math. She knew the pass. She had memorized it from photographs the way other people memorized songs. She knew that the eastern ridge was the obvious post, and therefore the post a competent enemy would clear first. And she knew that the water tower north of the station was, according to every report Dukob's people would have filed, a structurally condemned wreck with a sheared catwalk and no roof. It had a roof? She had checked it herself on the first night, climbing in the dark, lying down on the catwalk to feel whether it would hold her weight without singing, learning the precise place where the steel would not complain. By dawn of the 4th day, she had a position that did not exist on any chart, a clean line down the length of the pass, and a list of distances she had ranged and rearranged, until they were not estimates anymore, but facts she owned. This is the part that the people watching the thermal feed would never see, and the colonel would never understand. The shooting was the smallest part of it. The shooting was the last 4%. Everything that made the next hour possible had already happened in the dark, in the cold, in the patient accumulation of certainty by a person who did not believe in luck and had built her whole survival on refusing to need it. The third vehicle to lose its commander was a dust-colored troop carrier, 11 back in the column, and its death was the one that broke something in Major Lavin. Lavin was Dukob's senior field officer and the only man on that road whose fear, in this particular hour, was going to be useful, because Lavin's fear made him think instead of shout. He had been inside the carrier when the round came through the open commander's cupola, and he had felt the physical fact of it not as a sound, but as a pressure against the inside of his ears, and a fine spray of frozen grit kicked up off the lip of the hatch. He had ducked, which was useless and human, and then he had done the thing that would have saved them all if anyone had listened to him in time. He had started drawing lines. 3 men down. Lavin closed his eyes in the dark of the troop bay and placed each strike where it had fallen along the column, and from each one he drew a line backward along the path the round must have flown. He had been trained for this. A bullet does not curve on a whim. It obeys a small and unforgiving set of laws, and a man who knows the laws can read a flight path backward to its origin, the way a hunter reads a blood trail. He drew his 3 lines, and they did not point east. They converged, all 3, somewhere to the north and somewhere high, on a structure his terrain officer had marked on the map with the small annotation that meant ruined. Ignore. He keyed the secure channel. I need eyes north. The water tower. Thermal. Now. The reply came after a delay that felt much longer than it was. Major, the thermal's degrading at this range. The storm's pushing dust through the whole valley. I have the structure. I cannot resolve a body against it. There's heat coming off the steel from the morning sun, and I cannot tell you whether one of those signatures is a man or a hot rivet. Confirm or deny a shooter on that catwalk, Levin said. A pause. I can't, Major. Not in this. I would be guessing. Levin opened his eyes in the dark and understood, with the clean, cold clarity that comes to a man exactly once in a bad morning, that they were fighting something they could not see, could not range, and could not prove was even there. He keyed the channel again to call for the artillery vehicle, to put indirect fire on the tower, and erase the question with high explosive, and he got as far as the grid coordinate before the fourth shot arrived. It did not take him. It took the antenna array off the roof of his own carrier, 6 inches above his head, and the message that this was a choice rather than a miss arrived in his nervous system before it arrived in his reason. She could have killed me. She killed my radio instead. The man who can make that distinction at 3 kilometers in a dust storm is not a man you can win against by being brave. Up on the tower, Naomi worked the bolt and let the spent brass fall into the rag she had laid out so it would not ring against the steel. She was not thinking about the men. That is the part people refused to believe, and the part that was true. She was thinking about wind, which, in the throat of a pass, does not behave like wind anywhere else, because the rock walls funnel it and stack it and lay one current over another like sheets of glass at different temperatures. She had been reading the Dust Devils for 3 days, learning where the air did its lying. Between her and the column, the wind told 4 separate stories at 4 separate ranges, and her job, the only job, was to hold all 4 in her head at once and solve them faster than the men down there could die. The colonel finally let himself say it on the open channel, which was a mistake, because a column hears its commander's voice the way a body feels its own pulse. Where is the fire coming from? Not a question, really. A demand made to the universe. And the universe, in the form of 41 crews who had just heard their commander admit he did not know, answered by tightening every spine on that road. Holloway, in the back room of Halvik, watched the column stop tightening and start swelling, the lead vehicles bunching, the rear ones still pushing forward, the whole formation losing the disciplined spacing that was the only thing keeping it from becoming a single fat target. He had been a soldier long enough to recognize what he was seeing. He was watching an army forget how to be an army. "Get me a count," he said to Ferris. "How many tracks has she stopped?" Ferris swallowed. "Sergeant, I count 6 command elements down, maybe 7, and Sergeant, they're not advancing. They've been 30 minutes and they haven't gained 100 meters. Holloway looked at the dim doorway to the service passage and said nothing, because there was nothing to say that would not sound like a prayer, and he was not, this morning, entirely sure he wasn't praying. Levin did the smart thing, finally the thing that should have ended it. He sent men on foot. 4 soldiers, dismounted, peeled off the stalled column and began working north and west toward the base of the tower, using the dead ground and the folds of the wash where the line of sight from the catwalk could not reach them. This was correct. This was the textbook answer. A shooter on a fixed elevated post has one great weakness, which is that she cannot shoot what the structure itself hides from her, and 4 men in the dead ground beneath her could climb the tower's own blind side and end the problem with a grenade. Levin watched their progress on a handheld feed and let himself feel, for the first time that hour, something that was almost relief. Naomi had planned for the 4 men on the first night. She had climbed the tower in the dark, not only to learn the catwalk, but to learn what she could not see from it, and she had walked the dead ground herself and found the single seam of it that a smart officer would use. And she had done a small amount of quiet work there with her hands and a spool of tripwire and 2 of the noise and flash devices that were the least lethal things in her case. She did not want the 4 men dead. This is the thing the men in the stone building did not understand, and the colonel could not have imagined, and the people who would later watch a grainy reconstruction of this morning would argue about for years. She had decided something on the 3rd night lying on the cold steel that had nothing to do with her orders. She had decided that the first phase was stopping the column, and the second phase, the one no briefing had asked of her, was making sure that as many people as possible drove back down that pass alive enough to tell their grandchildren they had once been turned around by a ghost. So when the 4 men reached the seam in the dead ground, 2 of them tripped the wire and the wash filled with a white shriek of light and sound that took their night vision and their nerve but not their lives, and all 4 went to ground convinced they had walked into a prepared kill zone, which they had, except that the person who prepared it had built it to teach a lesson rather than collected debt. They lay in the wash and did not move. Levin, watching the handheld feed go to white and then to chaos, lost his picture of them entirely, and for a terrible stretch of minutes he did not know if his four men were dead. They were not. They were exactly where the woman on the tower wanted them, alive and prone and out of the fight, accounted for in her arithmetic as four problems she had solved, without subtracting four sons from four families. When the dust settled and Ferris's thermal picked them back up, all four were crawling back toward the column, slow, intact, and finished for the day. There is a kind of soldier who measures a victory by what she destroyed, and there is a rarer kind who measures it by what she managed not to. The second kind almost never gets a parade, because the absence of a catastrophe is the hardest thing in the world to put on a banner. By the second hour, the colonel had a decision to make and the wrong instincts to make it with. Dukov had built his career on momentum, on the doctrine that a column that keeps moving cannot be pinned, and every cell of him wanted to order the full push, to accept losses and ram the formation up the throat of the pass and over the station and be done. He had the vehicles. He had the men. He had, by any sober count, an overwhelming force. An overwhelming force does not lose to a single rifle. He had said this to himself 4 times in the last 40 minutes, and each time he said it, the count of his stopped command vehicles had gone up by 1. Major Lavin came to him at the lead element on foot, keeping low, and the 2 men crouched in the lee of the command track with the wind throwing grit against the steel, and spoke the conversation that armies have at the edge of every disaster. "She is not on the eastern ridge," Lavin said. "She is on the tower, and she is choosing. Sir, she has had a clean shot at you and at me both, more than once. We are alive because she has decided we are worth more alive, driving back down this road and telling the next column what happened here, then we are dead. That is not a marksman. That is someone running a plan. We are 3 moves behind." Dukov looked at his major for a long moment. He was not a stupid man, and that was his tragedy, because a stupid man would have ordered the push and been carried home in pieces, and the world would have agreed it was bravery. Dukov was smart enough to feel the truth of what Lavin said, and proud enough to need another 20 minutes and another 4 stopped vehicles before he could afford to act on it. Those 20 minutes were the longest of the morning inside Halvik. Naomi had moved. She did not stay on the tower because staying is how the brave die. After the flash and bang in the wash, she had gone down the tower's blind side along a route she had rehearsed in the dark until her hands knew it without her eyes, and she had crossed the open 70 meters to the station during the exact window when the colonel's drone was repositioning and the storm was at its thickest, and she had come up through the collapsed garage and into the service passage and walked into Holloway's command room without a sound, with snow-colored dust on her shoulders and the case in her left hand. The men looked at her. Sutter, with his black wrist, looked at her. Ferris, 23 and pale, looked at her. Ferris, 23 and pale, looked at her. And the youngest of them, a private first class named Lacey Orr, who had spent the last 2 hours certain she was going to die in a stone building on a road no one back home could find on a map, looked at the woman who had apparently been holding off an entire column alone and felt something move in her chest that she would not have words for until she was much older. "Status," Holloway said, because it was the only thing in his mouth that wasn't the wrong thing. "Column stalled," Naomi said. Her voice was even, unhurried, the voice of someone reading a tide table. "They'll send their flankers home in the next few minutes. Those 4 are out of it and unhurt. Their major has worked out where I was. Their colonel knows it too now. He just hasn't finished being able to say it. In about 15 minutes, he's going to make a decision. And there are only 2 decisions he can make. He pushes and he loses 30 vehicles getting over us and never holds the road because the relief column arrives into the back of him while he's still sorting his dead. Or he pulls back, files a report that says the pass is held in unknown strength, and lives to be wrong about something else tomorrow." Holloway studied her. "Which one's he going to make?" She was quiet for a second, and in that second, the omniscient truth of her was visible to no one in the room and would have surprised all of them, which was that she was not certain and that the uncertainty was the heaviest thing she carried, heavier than the case. Because a person who plans everything lives or dies by the one variable she cannot plan, which is the pride of a man she has never met. "The smart one," she said finally. "He's going to make the smart one, but he's going to need to lose a few more vehicles before he can forgive himself for it. So we hold. Nobody stands down. Nobody moves into the open. Nobody gives him a reason to believe he can win cheap. The road clears when he believes it costs more than it's worth, and not 1 minute before. She set the case down against the wall, the way a person sets down something that is part of them, and asked for water and drank it slowly. And Lacey Orr watched her drink and understood that the woman was tired in a way that had nothing to do with the morning, a tiredness with a long history to it. And Orr filed that away without knowing she was filing it. The colonel made the smart decision at the 11th vehicle. It was not a clean moment of wisdom. It was a man named Dukov, crouched behind steel with grit in his teeth, finally running out of the particular fuel that pride provides, looking at a column that had not advanced in 2 hours, and a major who would not stop being right, and a road ahead that his own instincts now told him was the mouth of something he could not fill fast enough to survive. He did the arithmetic he had been refusing to do. The corridor was not worth the column. It had never been worth the column. It had only been worth it if it was cheap. And the woman on the tower he had never seen had spent 2 hours and 11 vehicles teaching him that it would not be cheap. He keyed the handset, and the order he gave was the hardest sentence of his life, because it was made entirely of the word he had built a career on, never saying, withdraw. All elements, reverse and withdraw. Specialist Ferris, watching the thermal, made a sound that was not quite a word. Sergeant, he said, they're turning around, the whole column. They're pulling back. Holloway did not move for a moment. Then he crossed to the loose board, lifted it, and looked out at the pass, and saw with his own eyes the thing the sensor was telling him. 41 vehicles that had come up the road like a flood, now folding back on themselves, the rear ones already gone, the lead ones grinding into reverse. The whole great mass of them retreating down the throat of the pass and away from the station and away from the men inside it. He turned to Naomi. She was already breaking down her position, going through the case with hands that did not shake, accounting for every round she had fired and every one she had not, because the discipline of that accounting was the last wall between her and what the morning had actually been. Maintain until they're out of range, Holloway said to the room, and his voice cracked very slightly on the last word, and no one held it against him. Nobody stands down till I call it. It took 40 more minutes for the last vehicle to crawl out of thermal range, and the men of Halvik spent those 40 minutes in a silence that was not the silence of fear anymore, but the stranger, heavier silence of people who'd been handed back a future they had already finished grieving. Sutter cradled his black wrist and stared at the wall. Ferris kept rechecking the feed as if it might change its mind. And Lacey Orr sat with her back against the cold stone and watched the woman called Calder finish her quiet inventory and felt the question rising in her that she finally could not hold. How did you know, Orr said, that he'd turn around? How could you possibly know? Naomi closed the case. She looked at the young soldier for a moment, and what passed across her face was not pride and was not warmth exactly, but something adjacent to both. The expression of a person who has been asked an honest question by someone young enough to still expect an honest answer. I didn't, she said. You never know. You just make the other thing cost more than he can pay, and then you wait, and you hope he's the kind of man who can do math when he's angry. She paused. Most of them can't. This one could. That's the only reason any of you are going home. It is the only reason any of you are going home. She did not say it to take credit. The omniscient truth, the thing the narrator can see that the people in the room could not, is that she said it the way a person states a fact she finds almost unbearable, because the weight of having been the hinge on which 9 lives swung was not a thing she wanted, and not a thing she could put down, and she had learned a long time ago that the only way to carry a weight like that is to refuse to make it the only thing you are. The relief column reached Halvik 4 hours later, the storm finally lifting ahead of it, the satellites coming back online over a pass that held on every official feed no evidence of what had happened there. A road, a ruined station, 9 soldiers and a corporal with a wrist that would need surgery. Tracks in the gravel already softening under the wind. The deep churned scars where 41 vehicles had turned around already half erased, on their way to becoming nothing, on their way to being a thing that, by the next morning, the maps would swear had never occurred. The extraction helicopter took the woman first, by an arrangement no one was briefed on. Naomi climbed aboard with the case in her left hand and took the seat against the rear bulkhead, the one with the cleanest line to both doors, an old habit her body made without consulting her. She set the case between her boots. Below, the station shrank, and the pass opened out, and the road that had held 41 armored vehicles that morning became a thin, pale thread between the slopes, already losing itself in fresh dust, already being given back to the country it ran through. Lacey Orr rode in the same aircraft because the relief was rotating the original element out, and she sat across the bay and could not stop looking at the woman who had done the impossible thing and was now just a tired person staring out a window at a mountain. Or thought about what the woman had said, about making the cost too high, about waiting, about hoping a stranger could do math when he was angry, and she understood, in a way she would spend years growing into, that the woman had not been protected by anything that morning except her own refusal to gamble with other people's lives, that she had carried all of them across the worst hours of their lives alone, on a steel catwalk in a storm, and that she would carry the next 9 the same way, in some other place with some other name, and that no one would ever stand in a room and say what she had done out loud. Naomi felt the looking. She turned from the window and caught the young soldier's eyes, and Orr, who by every rule of rank and sense should have looked away, did not. She held the woman's gaze across the shaking bay of the helicopter, and what she put into it was not gratitude exactly, because gratitude was too small, but something more like recognition. A young soldier telling an older one, without a single word, "I see you, not the rifle, not the math, not the ghost they sent. You." The woman held it for 3 full seconds, then the corner of her mouth moved, just barely, the smallest possible thing, the kind of motion you would miss if you were not watching for it, and she turned back to the window. The helicopter climbed out of the pass and into the clearing sky, carrying 10 people away from a road where an army had stopped and reversed and gone home, away from a station that would lose its last wall to the next hard winter, away from the place where a single woman on a tower had decided, against every line of her orders, that the men everyone had written off were worth every cold hour, and every calculation, and every round she fired, and every round she chose not to. She had not done it to be known. The only record of her said she was already dead, and that record would say nothing about this morning, would carry no station and no pass and no count of the lives that drove back down that road because of her. She had done it because 9 people who should have been gone were alive on a mountain instead, and because that arithmetic, the arithmetic of subtraction, refused, was the only kind that had ever made sense to her, and because underneath every other number she had ever run, that one had always been the truest thing she knew. The mountain folded into the clouds beneath them. She watched it go and said nothing, and the quiet around her was not the quiet of a person with nothing to say. It was the quiet of someone who had already said everything she meant, in the only language she had ever truly spoken, 11 times, from a tower, in a storm, at a distance no one down there had believed was possible, for people who never knew she was there until it was already over.